Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for Friday, August 2nd, 2019. On today's episode, we're going to have a spoiler discussion of the latest Quentin Tarantino film, Once Upon a Time in ... Hollywood. And we have almost the whole team on today's podcast. This is Slash Film Editor-in-Chief Peter Sciretta. Joining me on today's podcast is Slash Film Weekend Editor Brad Oman.
Hey, that's me.
Senior Writer Ben Pearson.
Hey, what's going on?
Writers Hoai-Tran.
Hey, everyone.
And Chris Evangelista.
Hello, folks.
So news is still slow. That's hence why we're having the spoiler discussion, which we wanted to have anyways. Actually, Jacob planned this, and then Jacob couldn't be here. So
I feel bad. I feel like it's kind of my fault.
Oh, yeah, because he is traveling, and you didn't get a chance to see this until last night. You and Brad both, right? Brad, I'm actually kind of surprised you got around to seeing this because you've been busy with that whole move situation.
Yeah, I made sure to go out of my way to see this just because I didn't. Everyone was talking about it, and I didn't want to wait anymore. So this is the first movie that I had seen in theaters in like a couple weeks since I've been so busy with moving stuff around the house and helping my girlfriend move in and whatnot.
Yeah, I think I expressed my brief thoughts on this movie on the water cooler. Chris has already given his brief thoughts and extended thoughts on the site. Ben, have you said what you thought of? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah,
also,
I did on a water cooler as well. So I think we're just waiting on to see if Brad and HC liked it.
Yeah, but let's start with Brad.
Yes, I love this movie quite a bit. It's as many people have said before, it's a movie that for the most part up until the end is so much more tender and heartfelt than any other Quentin Tarantino movie. You really get to just sink into this brotherly bond between Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt's characters, but you also have the story that kind of runs along the side of it until it all comes together at the end of Margot Robbie as Sharon Tate, and this it seems like at first on the surface that she doesn't really have much to do, and the connection, to the other two characters is only tangential, literally, since she's just a next-door neighbor living with Roman Polanski. But I love that so much of what Margot Robbie does with Sharon Tate is just turns you into more than a historical footnote in the Manson murders. It turns her into a real flesh-and-blood character, someone who has a lot of charm and spunk, and she's just so excited, to see herself in a movie and really just going through life and enjoying it. And I think that also is kind of what Tarantino is doing here, is he revels and sticks at these moments of where things are just so relaxed, and you have these characters who are living in a world that is very quickly passing them by. But and even though you have someone like Rick Dalton who is worried that he's a has-been, you have somebody like Cliff who is still kind of just enjoying what he has while he has it. These long shots of him driving through LA and listening to, what is now classic rock. And, I just love how much Tarantino clearly has a passion for this time period and really just let us sink into it.
Yeah, not just this time period, but this place in the world.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. HT, what did you think?
I liked it. I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite Tarantino films, but I really liked how wistful and dreamy and, like everyone's saying, tender it is. It really makes you feel like this place and this time is a fairy tale that Quentin Tarantino has concocted and wants to live in and wants you to live in. And I especially enjoy the depiction of the friendship between Cliff and Rick Dalton. I absolutely love the chemistry that Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio had, but I also liked how just sensitive it was. It felt very sweet and something that is something unusual out of depictions of male friendships that we see. And I feel like this film does touch a little bit on the idea of white male fragility being something that is another thing that's kind of being lost in this sort of bygone era. The idea that these two characters are kind of being left behind as the world is rapidly changing, and that sort of concept of wanting to stay in this world. But I will say, I can't say that I personally connected to it as much as everyone else. I feel like it was a very specific fantasy that I couldn't personally relate to. I think one of sort of white Americana that I enjoyed seeing that fairy tale version of, but couldn't quite connect with because it wasn't something that I personally had a history with. For me, like the themes of that era being this loss of innocence was something that I get on a thematic level, but not something on a personal level.
Okay, we'll get into that a little bit later. This is interesting because I thought, as much as I really enjoyed this film, I thought I was going to be the one person on this podcast, offering criticisms of this movie. So I'm glad to have you as a co-conspirator here, HT.
Co-conspirator, yes.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about, I guess, the main relationship at the core of this film, Cliff and Rick. The Rick character, I guess, was based on Burt Reynolds. And is that true, Chris?
I mean, it's based on a lot of actors from that era. There's definitely Burt Reynolds elements there, and in fact, that entire FBI episode they shot was actually a recreation of an actual episode with Burt Reynolds in it. So there's definitely stuff there. There's also like Clint Eastwood there because Clint Eastwood was, sort of struggling in Hollywood and he was doing TV stuff. And then he went over to Italy and made a bunch of spaghetti westerns, and that sort of turned him into a star. So, there's bits and pieces of many actors from that era.
So what do you guys think about this relationship? I think this is the heart of this film. I would actually honestly say that there's not much that actually happens in this movie. If you were to pull out a piece of paper and write down the story beats of this movie, it would probably fail any screenwriting class in all of Hollywood. There's no structure. There's really no structure, but there is this relationship, and I feel like this relationship is what makes this film work. Do you guys agree? Disagree?
For sure, they're my favorite part of this film. I thought that I really liked the dynamic between them, in that Rick Dalton was this insecure actor who still kind of vacillated between insecurity and egoism, while Cliff Booth was kind of just there as his best buddy, but he wasn't always subservient. It felt like they were equals in some level, and that they were both washed up in a way or being ignored by the changing industry. And I just love that that sort of connection that they have, the camaraderie that they enjoy.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree that there's no structure, but because the movie is very clearly heading to an end point, and building to that over the course of it. But I know what you're talking about in that it doesn't necessarily fit in a traditional type of
thing. Yeah, what is the inciting incident of this movie?
Yeah, I don't think Tarantino gives a crap about any of those terms, especially not in this movie. But
I feel like most of his movies, you actually do, you could. I mean, I'm not saying they easily conform to the 3-act structure, but you could find a way to make them conform to the 3-act structure in a much easier way. And now, okay, we'll get to this later. Go on. I'm sorry.
No, that was all. I was just I think it's not a traditional structure, but there is a structure. It's not completely all over the place.
Well, okay, I guess what I'm saying, and this is my criticism of it, and for some reason it should bother me. This should make this film an F in my mind, but I really enjoyed this film, and this is probably in I don't know, probably my 4th or 5th Tarantino movie out of his, so it's in the middle there. And I really did enjoy it, but I feel like none of the characters, someone texted me, one of my friends texted me after seeing it and said, none of the characters make any decision that is meaningful and changes the plot until the 3rd act.
Well, I don't think that the lack of an A, B, and C in terms of the narrative mean that there's no structure in this plot. I agree with Ben in that I think it is leaning towards endpoint, but it is more about just you don't have to have plot as the.
But let's talk about the endpoint though. The movie never establishes that it's leaning to the endpoint. That's all dependent on your knowledge of history.
I was gonna bring that up. So let's open that up a little bit.
Okay.
How big of a deal do you guys think it is that Tarantino does not really go out of his way to help the audience out in terms of history? I'm curious what you all think about that.
It should be clear what we're talking about is the Manson murders at the end of this film. I mean, Charles Manson appears and they don't even call him Charles Manson. So if you didn't know going into this film, if you went in completely, as Jeff Kanata says in Slash Filmcast, unsullied, didn't know that this was about that, and maybe didn't recognize Sharon Tate, you might not know until the third act.
Of all the criticisms about this movie, I feel like this is the stupidest one. I can see not knowing who Sharon Tate is. I can see that, but I feel like if you don't know who Charles Manson is,
but they never say Charles Manson in the movie.
Do they really need to? I mean, there's a guy who looks a lot like Charles Manson in the movie. I feel like everyone should know who Charles Manson is. There's the ranch, there's the Manson girls, like that's so ingrained into pop culture. At the same time, even if you don't know who Charles Manson is, if you've somehow gotten through your entire life without ever knowing who Charles Manson is, the movie does a pretty good job establishing that the people involved with him are really bad news. The scene where Brad Pitt, where he goes to the Spawn Ranch, it's shot like a horror movie. There's all this like ominous atmosphere, and everyone is just very outwardly creepy and odd seeming. And then,
but then it ends up being a fake out that the guy is just asleep in the back. I mean, he might be drugged out or something.
They're still clearly using this senile old man who barely knows where he is. I mean, it's still pretty well established that at the very least they're guilty of elder abuse,
Yeah.
And then on top of that, that whole ending before the big violent ending, there's this entire sequence where the Manson gang, they're sitting in a car talking about murdering people. I feel like that's really all you need to know about these characters.
Well, yeah, but they only say that when does it appear? Like late into the second act, like near the end of the movie.
It's right before the big climactic.
Yeah. So what
ending.
I'm talking about like structure in that, like, if you're a audience member going into this film not knowing that this is about anything having to do with the Manson murders, that you don't know where this is going. Like it kind of is meandering, and I feel like that could have been fixed. I know you're saying this is the silliest criticism, and obviously I knew it, so it's not like I'm dumb and didn't know where this was heading. Like, it was kind of that like bomb that's underneath the table of like a Hitchcock movie or whatever. But I do think it could have all been fixed by like a title card at the beginning of the movie. It was like in whatever year.
No.
I want to say
that would be so bad, Peter. No.
Why?
Oh my God.
Why would that be? That happens on almost every single any single true story movie. Like, it starts with like a title.
Isn't in 1969, Charles, that would make it seem so hokey. Like the movie's not even really about that. It's more about Cliff and Rick. It's more about Hollywood.
I get that, but like, I think it's as much as this movie is good, it's bad script writing and storytelling to not establish what the movie is building up to.
I could not disagree more.
I agree with Peter to an extent. I do think that this movie is more about this time, this place, these two characters of a time gone by. But I do think that the Manson family murders, the shadow of it looms through the entire film and just kind of saturates every inch of this film so much that you can't escape what it feels like, what this whole horrific incident and what it's leading to. And this is kind of actually where I was talking about earlier with the cultural disconnect I was feeling. I didn't know much about the Manson murders until pretty recently. It was something I never really grew up thinking about or learning about because my parents didn't have that experience. My family didn't have that experience. They came to the U.S. long after that. And I felt like this movie felt so much like Tarantino, even though it was about these characters, just kind of looking at the Manson family murders and, giving his revisionist take, but giving his like fairy tale version of what if this era could be saved if this horrible incident had never happened. Because it feels like this, the whole theme of the movie hinges upon the murder and the changing of that murder. And
but I honestly, what I like about the vague framing of it is, I think it does exactly what I wish history would have done, and it shines a light on Sharon Tate as a person. It doesn't make Charles Manson famous.
I agree.
Yeah,
I think that it glamorizes the family.
The whole idea of changing history, doing this revisionist take, is that it's a world where Charles Manson isn't famous for killing these people, and Sharon Tate isn't lesser known just because she was a victim. And so, for me, I like the idea of it being vague because it takes away that legacy of Charles Manson and his, crazy group of hippies being the most famous part of that era and changing it. And I think that keeping it vague makes it so that the viewer just sees it as, doesn't think about Charles Manson as being this big deal. And it's merely just a footnote in what in this movie is a fairy tale. And I think it ties in with the idea, like Chris said, that the focus is supposed to be on Cliff and Rick and just this, this time in their lives, and not about this horrific event, which is what most people remember about this time period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think go ahead.
No, I was going to say, no, go ahead, Ben. You go first, and then I'll go.
I was just going to say, I think that that this entire thing is like a true alternate history. It's not like you guys have been saying, it's not just that the ending event was altered. It's Tarantino's fantasy of a history, a world in which everybody knows Sharon Tate for, the person that she was, instead of being a statistic or this sort of tragic figure. And the movie luxuriates in that. That's this movie is 2 hours and 40 minutes or something, and it's so much of just dipping you into this world and letting you watch her party and dance and love life at the Playboy Mansion and all of these things, and cruise around in a car with with her husband, and go buy a book and all these little things. And I think if Tarantino would have structured it in a way that I think Peter is implying, or address the actual real life Manson murders and what may have happened there, it would have instantly taken away from this special alternate reality that he's trying to create with the entirety of this movie, not just the last few minutes.
Let me just respond to that really quick. I feel like my problem is in objective storytelling. It's not in the execution of this movie. It's that Tarantino is trying to subvert expectations, yet he's not setting up those expectations. He's counting on you going into this movie with those expectations, and especially people, HT, you could take your age and times by 2, and that still would not be the amount of years that, do you know what I mean? There are people that don't know about this, and I have friends who saw this movie and didn't know it was about that until, after the movie,
But I also don't think it takes away from the getting lost in the story. For example.
Oh no, it definitely doesn't. But I'm just saying, I think objectively in storytelling, overall, I feel like to subvert expectations, you need to set them up.
I don't know. I wonder if there's I mean, this is an unanswerable question. There's no way that we can ever know what percentage of people who ever see this movie know about the Manson murders beforehand. But I think what you're probably getting at, Peter, is a failure in the education system in the United States. If, for people to be going into this movie and be completely unaware of this. I understand what you're saying.
I guess people don't need Inglourious Bastards did not have a thing telling me who Hitler is. Everybody knows who Hitler is.
Right.
But I do think Sharon Tate in the Manson murders is a much smaller thing than World War II.
Here's the best way I think you should look at this, Peter. So look at it like if this were like a Marvel movie, you could think of it as like the Manson stuff is like Easter eggs for people for like nerds who are aware of stuff. Like, the end of the first Avengers movie, you see like that post-credit scene with Thanos. I had no idea who the hell Thanos was when I saw that. But
yeah, but Thanos isn't the whole third act of that movie. Like that is.
But Charles Manson isn't the third act of this movie either.
Right.
He's in one scene.
Well, I guess my other problem with this is like, you have that whole scene at the ranch, which is great and cinematically great, and the tension just ramps up, and it's this great sequence, but it doesn't progress the plot in any way. Yes, we learn about these people that are living on this ranch, but like it's not like they found Cliff and Rick at the end of this movie because of that scene. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't.
Yeah, but why? But I feel like part of the movie is it's all about like chance. I mean, the real Manson murders of Sharon Tate. Like when Manson sent his followers to that house, he didn't know who was actually even living there.
Yeah.
It was just happened to. He actually thought it was someone else who used to live there that he knew. So even that is like, it's just like they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's bad luck for people who happen to be in certain.
I guess my problem is, I get that, but I guess my problem is that this movie is not building up to a third act in any way other than us knowing that ticking time bomb that is never fully, set up in the movie.
Well, I think that's your. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
I'm sorry. I want to get this quote out because I feel like we're spending so much on this one thing, and I feel like this sums it up. So Tarantino gave this interview to Time Magazine, and I'm going to read this full quote. It's a little long, but I feel like it's important. So, all right. Imagine this being said in Quentin Tarantino's really fast, sort of annoying voice. So
he's never going to call you again, Chris, after that comment.
I'm sorry, Quentin, my BFF for life. It would have been easy to come up with some kind of story for Sharon for this film where there would be more characters for her to talk to in order to move the story along. And the same for Rick and Cliff. But I had a situation where I thought, we don't need a story. They're the story. Let's just have a day in the life of these characters. And so the idea is that you just follow the three of them as they go about their day. In the case of Sharon, I thought there was something kind of wonderful about this person who lived, who has been defined by the tragedy of her death. Just the idea that she's driving around and doing errands, doing the kind of things that someone might do in Los Angeles. She's living her life, which is what, in reality, she didn't get a chance to do.
I mean,
I think that's what it all comes down to, is that this movie is not about plot, and I think that's where you're getting hung up a little bit, Peter. Is that you're spending maybe your friend sort of incepted you with this idea about like people affecting the plot, quote unquote. Tarantino just said like this movie is not really about plot; it's about the ambiance, the atmosphere, creating, immersing you in this place, and it's not necessarily about this happens because this happens because this happens. It doesn't. It like brazenly avoids and throws off the shackles of that type of structure.
Okay, can we talk about Sharon Tate for a second then? Like, I know a lot of people are praising this part of the film and Margot Robbie. I felt it was actually very underserved. I feel like if you're going to have her in this movie, I understand what he's trying to do, but like, why not let her get some kind of vindication, some kind of redemption other than her just living her life?
Well, did she? I mean,
that is the redemption. I think that is the redemption, though. And like,
but why not have her like show up at that? She hears noises.
No,
she goes.
I feel like she doesn't need to have that, though. I feel like what the quote that Chris said, the redemption, like what Brad is pointing to, is that she lives, and that's the beauty of it. That's her revenge in a way, and that she gets to live.
Right, and it's important to remember that the Sharon Tate in this movie, she's both, this version of Sharon Tate, but she's also like an ideal. Like she's almost like ethereal and almost like the best way I compare it to is like Laura Palmer in Twin Peaks, where she's this sort of figure that like sort of ties everything together. And the Twin Peaks revival was not all about, but I had this whole thing where Dale Cooper went back in time and saved Sharon Tate from being killed, and it changed everything.
And saved Laura Palmer, but yes.
Saved Laura Palmer. So the way Tarantino is using Sharon Tate in this movie, he's using, he's establishing her as this real carefree sort of person, but he's also looking at her as like this figurehead for the era, and sort of like saying that like the age of old Hollywood officially died with Sharon Tate dying, and that gave birth to the 70s and the new Hollywood era, and he's changing that. He's stopping that sort of happening. At the same time, I feel like the movie is also acknowledging that you can't really stop the future. One of the things I really like about the movie is Sharon Tate lives, but Rick Dalton, he gets invited up to Sharon Tate's house and he gets to hang out with them. But I still get the sense that his career is kind of dead. Like I feel like there's not anything really left for him in the business. And I feel like that's Tarantino's way of saying like, you can sort of alter the future, but sooner or later it's going to catch up with you.
That is really interesting, Chris, because my takeaway from this, and I want to hear what Brad and HT and Peter have to say about this too, is my takeaway from the very end was that that Rick Dalton, this was maybe the beginning of a new wave of his career, like meeting Sharon. He says earlier, like, oh man, I'm living next to the guy who directed Rosemary's Baby. Like, he sort of implies, like, if he could just meet with him, maybe, things could sort of turn around for him in a big way. And he's just coming back off of these spaghetti Western movies that theoretically will do a lot for his career, assuming that this character is indeed modeled on guys like Clint Eastwood. And for him to meet with Sharon at the very end, I think there's an implication there. I don't know. Maybe it's just
that's what I thought.
A difference of opinion or a different interpretation. But I read it as like, oh wow, he's meeting Sharon. That means he's going to meet Roman Polanski. That means he's probably going to either get cast in a Polanski movie or be introduced to a new circle of people that are sort of higher up in the Hollywood strata than he is. And maybe this is like that's the whole thing where I'm not really sure what Tarantino is actually saying with the ending of this movie. But anyway, before we get into that, what HT and Brad, what did you guys make of that?
That's actually similar to my reading too. I was going to save this comparison for later, but when we're talking about the final shots, but I saw this as sort of Tarantino's antithesis to The Great Gatsby, and I don't think it's a coincidence that we have imagery that recalls a lot of The Great Gatsby. The pool, Leonardo DiCaprio being there, the fact that all of these characters are more symbolic and archetypal than anything, even though they are real, they feel like real, living, breathing, bleeding human beings. At the same time, they feel like symbols in a tale of Americana. And I feel like that is something that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is trying to do. It's giving this different version of Americana, that different version of the American dream. And when Rick Dalton walks up the gates, that's him, that's, Gatsby finally finding his green light. That's him finally living that fairy tale ending versus the tragedy that the American dream actually invites.
That's the Gatsby comparison is interesting, especially because that just immediately made me think about the fact that Rick has that poster of himself out in front of his thing, which almost kind of ties to the idea of that, that the billboard with the glasses on it, Oh, like I just thought of that juxtaposition. I don't necessarily know if there's any like deeper meaning beyond that, but like I think tying into the idea of this loss of innocence in Hollywood, I agree with the reading of that. This kind of sets up Rick Dalton to continue his career almost as like Tarantino providing a way for the era that he loves in Hollywood the most to continue, for these fading stars to get new life and work alongside the filmmakers that would change the scape of cinema throughout the 1970s instead of losing, the Hollywood of the 1960s that led up to it.
That brings us into the Hollywood of 1969. Is this a fully realized version? Is this an idealized version? Like, what are we seeing here?
Oh, it's definitely idealized. I mean, I don't want to be the person to point it out, but there are very few people of color in this version of 1969 Hollywood. And while that's something that is sort of indicative of what the landscape was at the time, I felt like even more so, it felt like Tarantino idealizing and romanticizing this glamorous version of the 1960s and wanting to keep it alive, like Brad was saying. And that was something that I respected, but couldn't personally connect with because I felt like it was something that was so specific of a fantasy for him, and something that I felt like almost did away with the touching themes of those fading stars that we see with Rick Dalton and his arc, and his kind of coming to terms with the fact that his careers is at a standstill, and that his era of masculinity is coming to an end. So it was something that was a little complicated for me in terms of just like the ending and those themes and like what Tarantino was trying to say. I think that's why I didn't quite sit with me that well.
I mean, personally, I love Hollywood. I do agree with everything you just said, but seeing this version of Hollywood, the 1969 version, you know, all these places that Ben and I drive by every day, you know, I've eaten at some of these places. Like, these are places that still exist in Hollywood, and it maybe that made me enjoy the movie a little bit more than I probably should have, based on what I'm, you know, all my criticisms and stuff. It was cool to live in that idealized version of Hollywood, but yeah, I guess now that you mention it, like, you know, it didn't even occur to me that, yeah, there isn't that many people of color in this movie, although maybe that's something to be said. Like, wasn't the Manson murderers, like, weren't they trying to start a race war?
Yeah,
yes,
that was
were.
part of it. Yeah.
Helter Skelter.
Yeah. Okay, let's I guess let's talk about the FBI episode. What did you guys think of that?
Oh man, that's like
that was
the
my favorite part of the movie.
Greatest director's commentary. Like, those guys are just it's like talking about that, you know, like, this guy's a dick. Like,
oh, nice leap.
Yeah.
Yeah. No.
I like Chris. You posted about this on Twitter, and I like this idea, and I wish that they would do it of having Rick and Cliff do commentary for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, like have Leo and Brad do it in character. I think that's such a good idea.
Oh, wow.
It would be great. But yeah, I think this scene specifically is the crystallization of Rick and Cliff's friendship and why I loved it so much and how surprising and sweet it was. And it was for sure like my favorite part of the movie.
Yeah. Let's talk about the soundtrack, because I feel like with any Tarantino movie, people like to talk about the soundtrack. This one, I feel like, is not as talked about as most of his other films. Am I wrong?
I don't know. I knew a couple of these songs, but it didn't really hit me.
Yeah.
I guess I've never been somebody who's obsessed over Tarantino's music choices, but I know there are a ton of people out there, and probably a lot of people listening to this who do. So I wonder if any of you guys, like, you know, do you go out and like buy Tarantino soundtracks, you know, as soon as you can? Like, what's your relationship with Tarantino and the way he uses music? Like, has that ever hit you on an emotional level versus an intellectual level?
I mean, I think his soundtracks are fantastic. I don't buy music anymore. I listen to it on Spotify. But you know, when I was younger, I used to buy it. But the soundtrack for this is great. It's nonstop, almost more so than usual. Like, it feels like it's just constantly like blaring in the background, and I really loved it. And I listened to an interview with him the other day, with Tarantino the other day, where he was specifically talking about the soundtrack and how he put this soundtrack together. Was he basically had people go out and find recordings of the era of the local Hollywood radio stations. People who would just literally just hit record on a tape player to record whatever was on the radio. And he went through hours and hours of these tapes, and that's how he sort of picked out the songs for the movie. And he was saying, like, what was, maybe a number one hit nationally may not have been the same thing as a number one hit specifically in Los Angeles. So, in other words, like, the stations in LA, they weren't playing the same sort of music that was being played worldwide. And that's sort of why there's not like very familiar cuts on here, although there are a few, but there's a lot of, like, I guess obscure is the word I would use for it, because he was combing through these radio station ads and stuff like that.
I wonder how much of it was like, how detailed he got in terms of like, this song was on at this time of day, so I'm going to show Brad Pitt driving at this time of day with this music on. Like, I wonder if he got down to that level or if he sort of like tweaked it and took some liberties a little bit. But
I feel like he probably didn't go for accuracy in that regard with it, simply because I saw somebody point out on Twitter, I think it was Eric Snyder, that it's pointed out that the final events happened on like the hottest day of the year, but the actual day that year in California, it was not really hot at all.
Oh. All right, fair enough.
But I in addition to the soundtrack, one of the things that I love that Chris kind of alluded to here is that I love the extended shots of when they're driving around, hearing the different radio commercials for old school products. Like I could have sat and listened to that for a long time, just watching the shots of them driving. It was just an extra, little superfluous detail, but that helps really bring you into 1969 Hollywood. And even if you stick around for the credits too, which features a fun gag with Rick Dalton doing a commercial, there's an audio Easter egg, I guess, if you will, where Quentin Tarantino used a real radio clip of Adam West and Burt Ward doing a giveaway on a Los Angeles radio station as Batman and Robin. And so it's just like fun little stuff like that he just pulled as many details as he could to, make 1969 Hollywood.
Yeah, no, great to mention that. No, back to the music for 1 second. I think what my criticism of the music is not that obviously it works in this movie and it's interesting, unique choices. But I feel like usually coming out of a Tarantino film, you have an obscure track or two that like hits popular culture. You come out of Pulp Fiction and there's like stuff in there that was not like number one hits that became number one hits, and the same with like Kill Bill or any of his movies actually. Maybe not Jackie Brown. Actually, no, even that song from Jackie Brown I think probably got a boost. But I don't know. Maybe it might also be that I'm not listening to the radio and stuff, but it doesn't seem like any of these tracks are being
like popping in the same way.
Yeah,
I feel like this soundtrack works almost like in the context of a rock opera or an opera in a way. It's part of the fabric of the universe, and that's why it feels so essential to this movie rather than being just a pop soundtrack. It feels like something that's just part of the landscape.
I mean, you are right. Filmmakers like Tarantino and even Paul Thomas Anderson and Aronofsky, I feel like in their careers, early on in their careers, they were a lot more bold and stylistic with their choices. And I feel like as they're getting into their later careers, are more just trying to establish that sense of world and story. And it's not about like noticing a cool, clever shot or edit or, song. So I would say that's probably true here with Tarantino as well. We need to fast forward a little bit. Let's talk about the Bruce Lee scene. I know the family of Bruce Lee was kind of upset about this scene. Chris, are they wrong?
I would never presume to tell the family of Bruce Lee that they're wrong about.
Tell them they're wrong, Chris.
No. I definitely see where they're coming from. I feel like this is more a problem of audiences than what Tarantino is trying to do. Because I get it. Every criticism I've read of this scene, even the one from Bruce Lee's family, was saying like when they saw the film, the audience was like laughing and they felt like they were laughing at their father. And I really don't think that's how Tarantino is trying to portray him here. I do think he's trying to bring Bruce Lee down to like a human level, if that makes sense, because Bruce Lee has become this, iconic, almost like godlike figure, and Tarantino is trying, not just Bruce Lee, but everyone in this movie. He's trying to show that they're, real people. At the same time, I also feel like it's important to remember this scene is being perceived specifically from Cliff's point of view. Like it's a flashback to something Cliff is remembering, and I feel like that makes it sort of like an unreliable narrator situation because, Cliff obviously in his mind, he's going to look at that entire scene as him coming out ahead. And obviously he's going to remember Bruce Lee as being a jerk and him being justified. And I feel like that's sort of like the lens you have to look at that scene through. It's entirely through his memory. And at the same time, that scene, when it cuts back to Cliff on the roof remembering it, he says like, fair enough. And it's sort of him acknowledging that he was actually being the dick in that situation in retrospect.
I'm wondering too, because a lot of this movie are characters that are based on real people, but they aren't real people, Cliff and Rick, as we've discussed, but Bruce Lee is Bruce Lee. So why, I'm wondering why Quentin Tarantino made that distinction with that character in that scene and not others.
Well, I know Tarantino has always declared himself a devout fan of Bruce Lee, and Bruce Lee himself was somewhat tied to Sharon Tate because he trained her for several films, and at one point during this is what I read, that Polanski had actually accused Bruce Lee of being involved in the murders at some point. So I think that was part of the reason why he was included in it. I do want to say I had a little trepidation coming into this scene in particular because of all the discourse that I'd read about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood before I went to see the movie, and I tried to keep away from the discourse as much as possible. The Bruce Lee scene did actually touch a nerve with me. And there's a great, really even-handed article from the LA Times that touches on everything that Chris actually just mentioned. But I don't think I would necessarily agree with the humanizing element of it. I think that in the really brief scene that we see of him, it's like less than a minute long. I don't think that's enough time to humanize him. And in the end, it just feels like cutting down to size someone who is depicted in this kind of cartoonish way. But it's a great impression by Mike Moe. And in the scenes that we see of him that are wordless, I actually think that ends up growing and developing his character better than just like this scene. And I also kind of felt, to me, like it did feel like a fantasy scene because it was something that Cliff was, what for me I interpreted as misremembering. And I thought that was clear enough for me, but I could also see it not being clear enough for the audience. And for me, it just the overall impact of the scene did kind of sit uncomfortably with me.
Okay, Chris mentioned, the memories and us reliving, like almost like flashback our memories. There is this strange scene where Cliff maybe kills his wife. Is it an accident? Is it intentional? HT, what did you make of this scene? I feel like it might be a little bit problematic in the way it's presented, of like her kind of
being the shrill character and him basically aiming a gun at him and then it cutting away before anything happens. I didn't really know what to make of the scene either. I thought that perhaps it was some sort of quote unquote Easter egg or like reference to the times, or maybe it was something that was speaking to that overarching theme of rugged masculinity being left behind in the times, and something that these characters were having to grapple with and were not equipped to grapple with, and that they could no longer get away with this kind of thing, although he did get away with it. So I feel like it was
the question
like that.
The question I wanted to ask you is, like, the wife obviously died because we were told that, but he's not in jail. I mean, that could be the result of different times. I don't know. But do you think it was intentional for him to kill her? Do you think it was an accident? And how did that change your perception of that character in the movie?
I think it's implied that it's not an accident. I mean, the fact that they make her like this person who is clearly just like yelling at him and insulting him and like basically just like egging him on to like, do something about her, I guess. And just the way he's sitting there with, that I don't even know what kind of gun it was.
Like a harpoon gun or like a spear gun or something.
Yeah, he's sitting on his lap and it's pointed at her, and it looks like he's just like just waiting and contemplating it. And I feel like it probably did happen, but he maybe made it look like it was some kind of accident or something.
I mean, I feel like it's one of those things where there's no way to know, and it's deliberately vague.
Yeah.
Because, as we all know, Tarantino is not shy about showing violence. So the fact that he deliberately made this scene without an answer is his way of sort of like asking a tough question, because that scene really does, how you interpret that scene really changes how you interpret the ending. Because if it is saying that Cliff Booth is this like cold-blooded murderer who just flat out murdered his wife, he's secretly a violent sort of sociopath, and him getting away with killing the Manson girls at the end is like Tarantino saying like, this guy can literally get away with murder no matter what he does. At the same time, I don't know if it's like wishful thinking or what, but I get the impression that it was an accident for two reasons. One, and I've seen other people point this out, the gun going off accident thing feels like a direct tie back to Pulp Fiction, where John Travolta is driving in the car with the gun on the headrest and they hit a pothole and he accidentally blows that guy's head off. And that wasn't like an intentional murder. It just happened that way. And I feel like that, they're on the water. It's deliberately choppy. Brad Pitt is clearly drunk and he just happens to have that gun pointed at her. Another thing is like, it just seems really out of character for the way we see Cliff as a guy throughout the movie. Like, he seems like a really nice guy, for lack of, he loves his dog. He's got this really good relationship with Cliff, and I'm with Rick, and there's that lengthy scene with Margot Qualley's character where he deliberately asks her age, and he doesn't, he could obviously, she's like throwing herself at him, and he deliberately goes out of the way to not have any sort of sex with her, and he really cares about George Spahn. Like, he goes to the ranch, he's convinced they're using this old man for some reason. So there are all these hints throughout the movie that deep down Cliff is kind of a nice guy. So that is what makes me think it was an accident. But at the same time, there's no real right answer, I think.
Yeah, and really quickly, I know we've pretty much come to the end of this particular part of the discussion, but really quick, I just wanted to mention that when I was on sets all the time, like several years ago out here in LA, you would hear stories about different people, and it's just, I think it's part of like the gossipy sort of environment that happens when you get movie stars together and people, working together in such a tight way for months on end or whatever. There was this rumor going around that this really, really prominent TV personality was cheating on his wife. And like, I have no idea if that was true or not, but all of the crew guys were talking about it all the time. And for Kurt Russell's character, the stunt guy or the stunt coordinator or whatever he was in this movie, to raise that issue with Rick Dalton, and for Dalton to be like, really, like, you believe that shit? It just sort of struck me as like yet another one of those examples that Chris was just talking about, where like you could consider this to be one of those things that if it was an accident, you could easily see how word could spread throughout the community that it was a murder, because people are just sort of gossipy, and especially in this sort of environment. So anyway, I'm not like trying to. I think it's purposely ambiguous, like you said, and it does add this extra complexity that is unanswerable, but I think it's interesting to talk about nonetheless.
I guess what I'm confused, I like it, but I'm confused of what Tarantino was trying to accomplish with that bit of backstory to that character.
I mean, I was just trying to complicate somebody, like to make you stop and think, and to maybe not have it be just a clear case of white hat, black hat, that kind of thing. I think it's just to give you a moment of pause.
Yeah, I agree. It makes you question everything he says and does more, and I think that makes just his character and his dynamic with all the other characters much more interesting.
Okay, we should probably mention the scene with the child actor. It's probably one of the more, I don't know, like, you don't really get to see this side of Tarantino in these movies. I know, Chris, you talked about this, I think, on the water cooler episode, but I just love the interaction between Rick and this child actor.
I'm pretty sure this is like the only Tarantino movie with a child in it. I don't think. Am I wrong there? Or
no, you have Kill Bill with.
All right, the daughter,
child,
two daughters. Yeah, all right. So yeah, there is that. But yeah, the stuff with the child actress, her name is Julia Butters, and she's so good in this, is so weirdly sweet. And I really love, not only do I love her in the scene, I really love the way DiCaprio plays this scene and just the character in general, because he plays it in this way where, yeah, you can take it as like humorous, you can take it as like it's meant to be sort of comedic, but at the same time there's this really poignant like sadness to that DiCaprio character, like that part where he's talking about the book that he's reading, and the character in the book is almost like identical to his point of view, and he just starts like breaking down. And that, I was really like touched by that, just the way, both how DiCaprio handles it and how the child actress like comforts him, and then the whole payoff later where she tells him that was the best acting she's ever seen. And on one level that should sort of be like, well, what does she know? She's a kid. But on another level, he's really touched by that. Like, he's really, really taken aback by that, and he's so like happy to get that compliment. And it's just a really oddly sweet sequence.
Also, did you guys, just a side thing, did you guys notice that the girl who played Uma Thurman's daughter in Kill Bill was one of the hippies in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I
didn't know that.
She's in the car. She's the one who drives away.
She's the one who actually sells Brad Pitt the acid cigarette.
No, you're thinking of Uma Thurman's actual daughter, who is actually in the movie. But
okay.
Yeah,
never mind then.
The actress who plays Uma Thurman's daughter in Kill Bill is Perla Haney Jardine, and she plays the hippie that sells Brad Pitt the acid cigarette.
That's cool.
Yeah. Did not know that.
We also saw Zoe Bell, who is the star of Death Proof?
Mm-hmm. Yep. She's also Tarantino's stunt coordinator for this movie and Death Proof.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about that long scene that we see Rick Dalton film for that cowboy TV show, which I feel like, and I feel like this is my overall thought on this movie. In any other movie, that shouldn't work. That we're like taking a break from the story of this film to show you a scene from a TV show that the character is filming, like an extended, like not like just a small bit of a scene, but extended scene. But it's so delightful.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, this is like, Tarantino wanted to be an actor, and I think the scene with the child actor that we were just talking about sort of speaks to this as well. He has like a real appreciation and respect for the craft of acting, and I think this movie is maybe like, he's had some elements of that woven throughout a lot of his films, like even going back to Reservoir Dogs and Tim Roth's character, like you could tell that he cares a lot about what it means to be an actor and how we all act within our lives. Like that's something that sort of runs throughout Tarantino's entire filmography. But I think, in a movie about actors, this is his most like blatant way of depicting that and showing that and sort of like literalizing that theme and that idea. And like also the mixture of high and low that Tarantino is sort of known for, like blending pop cultural elements that a lot of people would write off as trash or whatever. Like, nobody really cares. Nobody talks about Lancer anymore. Like this sort of like almost forgotten show from the 1950s and 60s or whatever. But for him to sort of drop us into an episode of that and treat it in the cinematic language, it's not the camera isn't pulled back. You don't see boom mics and you don't see the crew making it. We are immersed in the perspective of this almost forgotten TV show, and I think it's Tarantino's way of saying like, this stuff was just as valid then as some of the, maybe not just as valid, but was valid. It wasn't just a throwaway kind of piece of entertainment that people spent time and effort and threw their hearts and souls into making stuff like this. And I think it's just his way of sort of like tipping the cap to that. But I don't know, that was just my read on it.
Yeah. Another great sequence in this movie is that sequence we mentioned before at Spawn Ranch. What did you guys think of the Spawn Ranch sequence? Because I feel like, this is typical Tarantino. We feel the dread, we feel where it's headed, but we know that he's going to subvert expectations in some way. And then when he does, and the guy doesn't, the guy has worked with him but doesn't even remember him. What is Tarantino saying with this, Chris?
I think so. There's many ways to interpret this scene. One is obviously it establishes the Manson family in the context of this movie and what they're doing, and on another level, if you are familiar with the Manson family, you're going to know a lot of stuff that's going on here, and the background, the stuff with the horses, and on another level, it's showing.
Wait, what is going on there? Because I actually don't know enough about the Manson family to know what's going on with the horses.
Well, they're making money by giving tours of the ranch on horseback, which is what they were doing. At the same time, there was actually like a murder that happened on the Spahn Ranch that guy Tex carried out, which they don't talk about that at all in the movie. But if you're familiar with the story, you're going to know that. The way I see that scene is, so Brad Pitt, he goes in down the hallway, he talks to Bruce Dern's character, and Bruce Dern's character is this old washed up guy who doesn't know where he is, and he doesn't have anyone taking care of him, and he's just he's got, the only one who's taking care of him is Dakota Fanning's character, Squeaky Fromm, who is one of the Manson girls, and she's clearly just using this guy. They're all using this guy for his land, to live rent free. And it sort of establishes this old man who's just all alone in the world. And, the heart of this movie is really that friendship between DiCaprio and Pitt's characters. And, there's that whole final scene, which I love so much, where Brad Pitt's like in the ambulance, and DiCaprio says like, "Oh, you're a really good friend." And he says, "I try." And I feel like that's sort of like the perfect summation of what this movie is really about. It's really about that friendship between these two guys. And by showing, this old lonely man
who doesn't have a friend.
Right. It's sort of like Cliff realizing that, he needs, because I feel like the movie makes a big deal of showing that Rick needs Cliff more than Cliff needs Rick. Cliff is doing all these odd jobs for Rick, and what is Cliff getting out of this relationship other than the occasional stunt work? And I feel like that sort of lays the ground for that what he's getting out of it is like a friendship. And Cliff, his wife is dead. Everyone is spreading these rumors about him being a killer, so it's unlikely he has really any friends in the world. And I feel like that scene is him sort of being reassured that his friendship with Rick is something that is worth keeping.
Okay, I think we've gone overboard with this podcast already, but we need to talk about this final 30 minutes of the film, which is kind of when things kick into high gear, the third act, where they show up and he yells at them for making too much noise with the car outside. And that action is what causes them to go for his house and not Sharon's, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what is Tarantino saying with this change in history?
Yeah, that's my big question with this, because a lot of people have pointed out that this movie, with what he does at the end, it sort of makes the entire movie feel like it's sort of culturally conservative, where Tarantino is like preserving this period that he loves instead of, I guess, allowing progress progress at a cost, at a horrible human cost that happened in real life. But instead of, he's rewriting history, so theoretically that wouldn't happen in the same way. And Chris, I wonder if you could expound a little bit on your reading of the end of the movie, because you talked about this a little bit earlier, but with you reading it in the way that maybe Rick Dalton's career is over. Do you think that because Tarantino? Do you think that Rick's career may be over because Tarantino himself has such an appreciation for the sort of new Hollywood era, and he would never create an alternate world where that doesn't happen in the same way? What did you think about that?
I'm really curious to see how many people have this opinion that I have, or if I'm just 100% way off here. But really, the way I interpret that ending as being, more melancholy than it is, just by the way Tarantino shoots it and the way the characters carry it. I'm not talking about the Manson attack, which is we should talk about the tone of that, but I'm talking about how that final shot where it's that crane shot up above. There's something really like lonely and sad about that shot to me, where Sharon Tate welcomes Rick into the house, and yeah, he's being welcomed in, but I just can't picture him becoming a movie star. And I think that's like sort of the way DiCaprio plays the character. He plays him as this like goofball, and his career is getting better because he's doing these spaghetti westerns, but there's just something about the way the tone carries itself. And I don't know, maybe a part of it is like I'm letting the real, like what really happened, sort of cloud my mind, and I'm acknowledging that Hollywood did change. But I get the interpretation that Tarantino, he wants to save Sharon Tate, not so much that he wants to save that era. And again, I could be way off here, but that's how I see it. And just the way, like, even though DiCaprio has that whole, you're a good friend thing with Cliff, I get this impression that they're still going to go their own separate ways, because that whole build up to that end scene is Rick cutting Cliff loose because he's just gotten married and he can't afford to pay him anymore. And I really get the impression that, he still thinks of Cliff as a good friend, but I still sort of get like they're going their own ways. I mean, they literally are going their own ways in that final shot where Cliff is being, taken to the hospital and Rick stays behind. And that's sort of why I get that melancholy tone from the end.
But I was going to say, if his career does blossom because of this, then he would have the money to hire Rick.
I mean, yeah, there's that too. I feel like hire
Cliff. Sorry,
like the boat scene. There's really no right or wrong answer here. It's more like interpreting how I feel like this change of history raises a million questions because. Charles Manson, all right, yeah, he didn't get away with killing Sharon Tate here, or not get away, but he didn't carry that out. But who's to say he didn't go off and kill someone else? And maybe Sharon Tate living resulted in some other movie star being killed. And, I feel like that's sort of, for lack of a better word, the fun of the ending, because, yeah, it changes history, but it also writes a whole new history that we don't really know anything about. It's this whole alternate universe.
I really like what you said, Chris, about Tarantino wanting to save Sharon Tate and not wanting to save this era of history, because that was something that I've been kind of mulling over and deciding and trying to think of whether I like the film or not, because I kind of felt like this cultural fixation on the Manson murders ascribes more importance to it and more historical relevancy to it than it should. I feel like this idea that this one event ended a whole era and ended this era of innocence is almost a little reductive. In a way, this is just my personal opinion. I can't speak to a larger historical effect of the Manson murders. I know it did have an historical effect, but I feel like the cultural fixation on it has always been a little bit too, I don't know, morbid or ghoulish to me. But I like what you said, Chris, about this being more about just wanting to save a person, save people who were, wrongfully murdered. And I did really like the melancholy in that final scene in which he's walking up to Sharon Tate's house. And it occurred to me that he's walking up there with ghosts, and that these people in reality, never survived. And it has that melancholy and that wistfulness that I think the rest of the film did successfully give. That's why that kind of left an effect on me. But yeah, I think the overall themes of the movie was, I'm still kind of processing.
Right. And, to piggyback off of that, like, yeah, I said earlier that Sharon Tate sort of represents this era, the character in the film. But I do feel like what Tarantino is going for with this ending, where he lets not just Sharon Tate, but all the people in that house live, because they were all killed. The hairdresser friend that was secretly in love with her, and the Folgers heiress, they were all murdered. And he doesn't just save Sharon Tate, he saves all of them. And I really do feel like that ending is less about saving the era and more about robbing Charles Manson and his followers of the notoriety they got. Because like you were saying, HT, it's become this really ghoulish sideshow. Like, the Charles Manson became this sort of like pop icon because of this. And that's really shitty when you think about it. When I was in New Orleans, there's this thing called the Museum of Death, and that's morbid to begin with, and it has all this stuff about crime scenes and stuff like that. And at the Museum of Death, they actually had like real crime scene photos from this murder, and there's like a picture of Sharon Tate dead. And I wish I had like never gone in that building and seen that, because it really fucked me up. Like just seeing her dead body, and she's pregnant, and I feel like this ending it erases that. It gets rid of that terrible fate these characters suffered, and it gives them their life back. And that couldn't happen in real life. There's the Stephanie Zacharak's review in Time magazine, which is like one of my favorite movie reviews of all time. She says at the end of it, I'm paraphrasing it here, but like in real life, no one could save Sharon Tate, but Tarantino and Margot Robbie's performance, it gives her the happy ending she never really had. And I think that's sort of why I am interpreting the ending to sort of be, it's happy for Sharon Tate, but Rick Dalton is still pretty much on the same course he's always been on.
Well, I guess to kind of add to that too is just a final touch is that the title for the movie happens right in that final shot, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and that's exactly when what you would call this fairy tale world that Quentin Tarantino created kind of begins.
Yeah, exactly. I do think that title card placement is really, really deliberate. Just the way it's because it could have happened on a black screen, but he literally puts it over that shot.
Yeah.
Is there also a sadness there that obviously Rick has, killed these evil murdering group, but it almost seems like this film is projecting that he's getting more satisfaction in, like, he feels more fulfilled that the star next door knows who he is.
I mean, yeah, that's part of that's one of the reasons I love that scene too. The way DiCaprio plays it, where Jay Sebring tells him that Margot Robbie, that Sharon Tate thinks of him as a movie star, whereas the whole time, he was thinking of her as the movie star, and he looks so touched by that. It's really, that again ties into like the melancholy of that ending.
Yeah, I think it's intentional, and it goes into what Chris was saying earlier about de-glamorizing and taking away the importance of the Manson murders. It's about Rick Dalton and his getting validation from this person that he's always admired, and Sharon Tate living and all of that stuff, and just kind of for leaving the Mansons in the dust.
Now I'm thinking more about that final shot, Chris, and you have me wondering if, like, that sort of God's eye view looking down. You were just saying, like, he could have put the title screen over a black, or the title over a black screen, but he chose to leave it up there. He could have moved that camera down into the house as the credits were rolling or something, and let you see what happens when Rick Dalton actually interacts with Sharon Tate in a meaningful way inside. But he keeps it outside. He keeps it, that part left to the imagination. Right. And like, it's also like this God's eye view of like, it sends us out of the theater looking almost like as if we're stepping back from peering into another world. And yeah, I wonder if I don't know. You got me thinking there, Chris. I don't know. I don't know if I'm like fully ready to change my interpretation of what may happen to Rick Dalton, but like the visual language of the scene, right, or that shot maybe does support your read a little bit more.
Yeah, it's a world we glimpse this world, and now we have to leave. We're not invited any further than this. It's sort of like Field of Dreams. It's like Field of Dreams, where James Earl Jones is about to go in the cornfield, and Kevin Costner is like, "Well, I want to go too," and Ray Liotta is like, "No, you can't." That we're Kevin Costner, and Tarantino is Ray Liotta saying you gotta stay outside.
I think no matter what your interpretation, it is the happily ever after ending of this fairy tale. It's not a coincidence that the movie is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's about that fairy tale ending, whether you think it's something more for Rick or whether it's just his happy ending isn't being validated by Sharon Tate and then meeting her finally.
Right.
For sure. Do we have any final thoughts on this film? I think we've probably said it all, but anybody?
I do think the one thing we should touch on is the tone of the Manson scene where Cliff Booth brutally murders 3 people.
Oh, yes,
because this has drummed up controversy I wasn't expecting, where people make it sound like they feel bad for the Manson family, which is really weird to me, because there's this argument going on here, and maybe this ties into people not being as aware of the Manson murders as I always thought they were. But the brutality of that scene, and it is exceedingly brutal. People seem to be thinking oh, Tarantino is reveling in this violence, and he is, but I feel like the reason he does that, he makes it so violent, is because he's so angry at these characters for what they did, and rightfully so, because I come back to that Museum of Death image where I saw Sharon Tate's dead body, and it's well, that would make me angry too. And it's him sort of taking out this rage and frustration on these shitty characters who are just in real life just terrible people. And but there is this faction of film Twitter, or whatever you want to call it, who are oh, Tarantino has gone too far. He shouldn't have. Those poor Manson family members. So I don't know if was anyone else taken aback by this beyond acknowledging that yes, it's violent.
I did think it was more violent than a lot of the stuff that Tarantino has done. It reminded me of S. Craig Zoller levels of violence. But I never once felt bad for those people. I did think a little bit, I have to admit, about the optics of this brutal violence against women that is in a movie that is made in 2019, and we're just culturally more attuned to have a red flag raised when we see something like that, because it's just so far afield from what is in a traditional movie these days, or what should be, or what our ideals should be, as a society. But I think you're right, Chris. I mean, for me, it was just so much this catharsis that he was putting into and hoping that we felt of righting this historic wrong, and maybe even condemning us a little bit as a society as a whole for spending so much time fixating on the Manson murders and turning them into this sort of pop cultural icon, instead of just relegating them to the dustbin of history kind of thing.
Right. And I guess this really, really does tie back into how much you know about the case. And, the real Susan Atkins, she's one of the women who gets killed at the end there. In real life, Sharon Tate was I'm pregnant, please don't kill me. And she said, I have no sympathy for you and your baby, bitch, she said, before stabbing her to death. And I have no sympathy for someone in real life who did that. I'm not saying I would smash their face into a fireplace or whatever like that, but I feel in the world of this film where, you can get away with that, it makes sense why he's going so brutal on these people, because they in turn were brutal in real life. It's sort of he's turning the tables on them. He's turning their needless brutality back on them.
Do you think also there's a commentary here about Tarantino's films himself? Because Tarantino, is a filmmaker that known for his violence in his films. And throughout this film, there's moments where it could happen. There's, that sequence, that flashback sequence that we talked about with Cliff and his wife. And then there's the sequence at Spawn Ranch where things could go down, nothing happens. And then in almost spectacular fashion, at the end of this movie, the bad guys get their due, in probably even more horrific ways than some people want, obviously. But do you think this is at all Tarantino speaking about his own storytelling?
I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, that's a really good read on that, and I actually hadn't considered it, but I think you might be dead on with that.
Yeah, that didn't occur to me, but I think that's probably a correct read. Yeah.
There's one thing that I wanted to mention, that my favorite line in the whole movie is during this part of the film when I think it's Tex sort of bursts in the door and he's got the gun pulled on Cliff, and he says, I am the devil or something like that. And Cliff is like, no, it was something stupid, or like, your name, like, what was your name? And he's like, I'm the devil. I'm here to do the devil's business or something. And Cliff
I'm here to do devil shit.
Yeah, well, yeah, he recounts it as he said something about doing devil shit later when he's in the ambulance. But just like the deflating of the iconography there, and like the that's the kind of thing that like the culture has latched onto over the past 50 years, and like that those kinds of lines are what makes the Mansons and the family and all of that stuff so like scary to us as a culture. But for Tarantino to just wait one beat and then have Brad Pitt's character be like, no, you're a fucking idiot. It's not, I'm not scared at whatever thing you're trying to do here. You're just some fucking guy out from this ranch that I saw earlier. And then to completely obliterate everybody. I just thought that was like a really, it's like this movie in a nutshell, that line to me.
I think even the scene before that too, of like when we spend in the car with them when they're like planning what they're going to do, you get this idea that they're not these like masterminds or anything like that. Right. They're clearly just flying by the seat of their pants. Like they're like, the one girl comes up with like some stupid idea of what they should do like next. And they're like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. And then though they get duped by the one person who says, oh, I forgot my knife, and then she just leaves them behind and leaves with the car. It's Maya Hawke.
Is that something that actually happened?
It didn't happen like that. One of the girls there didn't want anyone to get killed, and she lied and said like, oh, someone's coming to stop them, but it didn't work. So it didn't actually happen like that.
Huh. We have talked a bit about where Rick ends up. Where do we imagine Cliff ends up after the events of this movie?
He goes back to Spawn Ranch and takes over. No.
I actually had a kind of a tragic chain of thoughts as to how that might play out, because the ending is kind of so ambiguous. I thought it would be really sad, but also somewhat, I don't know, appropriate in a way of it, because Cliff very clearly says like, you don't have to come to the hospital. It's like, stay, with your wife and whatnot. And I thought it would just be really sad if like Rick didn't see Cliff again and Cliff died at the hospital.
What do you think there's a possibility at all in this world, that, Cliff has a history of murder? There's manslaughter on his record, and now with what happened here, do you think there's a chance that he would get time or something for what he actually did to these people?
I feel like you could say self-defense, because they sort of broke into the house, but I don't know, maybe.
But also they're being brutally, head smashed in.
Yeah, there's one more thing that I wanted to mention here, and I feel stupid even bringing it up because I don't agree with it personally, but I feel like the listeners might want to know, for anybody who's sort of having trouble with the last part of this movie. I saw this theory posted on, I think it was on Uprocks, about the acid cigarette and the fact that Brad Pitt smokes that right before this brutality, that maybe the entire the deaths of the Manson clan are way more heightened and violent because it's all this sort of acid trip. And like really Rick Dalton actually has the flamethrower from 14 Fists of McCluskey like out in the back. Like that's such a ludicrous image. Like, I mean, I love it just on its face as like a real thing that actually happens within the world of this movie, but this theory is trying to posit that like maybe the ending is not exactly what we think. And I think the author was just saying like, he had a lot of trouble with like wrapping his mind around the ending of this movie, and that theory made him process it a little bit better. So I don't need that personally, and I prefer to take the movie at face value, but maybe that will be beneficial to some of our listeners out there who maybe have some issues with it or something.
I think that theory works in the fantasy aspect of this movie and the ending especially, and it feels like it's not saying that the murder of the Manson family was only a fantasy, but I think it plays into just that sort of the overall wishful themes of the movie itself.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. Okay, I think that officially brings us to the end of today's Slash Film Daily. You can find more of all our work at slashfilm.com. I'll link Chris's extensive review of this film in the show notes. The Slash Film Daily is published every weekday on iTunes, Google, Overcast, Spotify, all the popular podcast apps. Please feel free to send us your feedback, questions, comments, concerns to us at peter@slashfilm.com. Do you have some theories that we didn't bring up? Do you have some observations that we missed? Send them to me at peter@slashfilm.com. And please, as always, rate and review this podcast on iTunes. Tell your friends. Spread the word, and we'll see you on Monday.